In the novel, the protagonist, fresh out of college with a seemingly useless history degree, finds themselves stuck in a fruitless job search. Just when hope seems lost, an unexpected email arrives from Luna Holdings, offering an interview. A surprise considering the protagonist doesn't recall applying to the company. Despite initial skepticism born from past encounters with job scams, curiosity and desperation lead them to investigate Luna Holdings and ultimately accept the interview. During the interview, the enigmatic boss, Lilith, reveals a peculiar job opening, an executive assistant position with unconventional demands. The job entails working in an eerie corporate environment where the protagonist is tasked with running errands and handling unusual shipments, including crates of soil, coffins, and antique furniture. An encounter with a strange colleague, Jack Gray, heightens the novel's tension. Gray's unsettling demeanor, odd physical attributes, and peculiar interest in a blood-stained shipping manifest create an atmosphere of unease. The protagonist accidentally cuts their thumb on the manifest, leaving a trace of blood that Gray seems disturbingly fixated upon. This unsettling event is compounded by Gray's suggestion that there are secrets within the company that one might not wish to uncover. Navigating this surreal workplace, the protagonist forms a cautious bond with Lilith, who intervenes when Gray's behavior crosses a line. Lilith, a formidable figure adorned with multiple academic accolades, promises protection but also emphasizes the harsh reality of earning one's place in this eerie corporate hierarchy. As the story unfolds, the protagonist begins to suspect that Luna Holdings is more than just an ordinary company. The shipments, the strange employees, and the ominous atmosphere allude to a hidden world operating beneath the surface of everyday business. The novel teases at supernatural elements, suggesting that the protagonist's job might involve dealing with things far stranger than mundane office politics. Ultimately, Shadows of Luna weaves a tale of mystery and suspense, following a naive graduate's descent into a corporate labyrinth where the lines between reality and the unknown blur. It explores themes of survival in a cutthroat professional world, the consequences of curiosity, and the hidden depths of human nature. As the protagonist uncovers the truth behind Luna Holdings, they must decide whether the price of knowledge is worth the dangers lurking in the shadows. Chapter 1. I should have known this job would be trouble. At first, I couldn't get over how lucky I was. A year after I graduated, I was still looking for work, my newly minted bachelor's degree in history about as useful as lead shoes. Nevertheless, I diligently wrote up a resume that couched my academic abilities in the best-sounding terms possible and relentlessly shipped it out to every available opening, anything from warehouse work to security to a poker dealer in a casino, and it all came to zip nada nothing until I dragged myself out of bed one morning to find an email waiting in my inbox, responding to my response to a job post I didn't remember applying to. As I sat on the old kitchen table that acted as my desk and shivered from the cold wood of the chair touching my bare thighs, I yawned and clicked on it, expecting a polite, long-belated thank you but no thanks, and the usual curt message about my skills not meeting the needs of the position. Instead it read, "Loved your resume. Sounds like you have the skills we're looking for. Call me to set up an interview. L. Chambers." There was some other stuff, the usual corporate email signature and a phone number and address and all. The company was called Luna Holdings. Maybe they found my resume on one of the job sites where I posted it? The idea was absurd, almost magical. My toes squeaked on the linoleum kitchen tile as I curled them under my feet and chewed my lip. Something about this didn't sit right with me. We career job seekers have to be wary of scams. I almost got taken in by that door-to-door knife selling program, and a really exciting email once turned out to be a job standing around in a supermarket selling herbal remedies. It wasn't even a job. I had to buy my own pills, so I was as leery as I was eager when it came to jumping on any opportunity that I didn't feel totally comfortable with. So I jumped on the internet and started searching every variation of Luna Holdings I tried brought up nothing, well, nothing related. There was a lot of bad poetry, video game stuff, and of course porn. A porn star named Luna Holdings. I leaned on my palm and stared at the screen. Something made this smell like a bad idea. I had my cell phone in my other hand, running my thumb over the buttons without pressing them as I stared at the contact number. Decided if it sounded fishy, if they had an interview time already chosen, if it was a group interview. If they talked like all I had to do was sign up, I'd just hang up. I dialed the number and waited. It rang twice and a woman with a velvety smooth voice picked up. For a second I thought I'd called a phone sex line. Luna Holdings. Lilith Chambers speaking. How can I help you? I swallowed, and my voice came out a little squeakier than I'd have liked. I got an email about my application. I wanted to set up an interview. Oh yes, you must be Karen. I've been waiting for you to call, dear. Right, I said, holding the phone a few inches away from my head so I could stare at it. Butterflies fluttered in my stomach. This was getting weird. It was her voice. It was familiar to me somehow. I reached to place it, but I couldn't, but that didn't make it feel any less like I'd heard that voice before. I blinked. She was talking. I said, when are you available to come in? Any time, I guess. Would tomorrow work? Sure. Around noon. Sounds good. At the address in the email. Yes. I'm looking forward to meeting you. My secretary will forward you a confirmation. Same here, I said in my cheery, please give me a job, I can't make my student loan payment this month voice. We exchanged pleasantries and I hung up. My hand was shaking and I put the phone down. None of the warning signs had popped up. No mass interview, no instructions about what to wear for some reason if they warn you to dress professionally. The job is probably a fake-out small business opportunity thing. I guess scammers can't contain their contempt for the unemployed. I'm not the kind to count my chickens, so I spent the rest of the day applying for jobs, then hit the gym. I slept fitfully that night, awaking every hour or so in that anticipatory way that you do when you're afraid the alarm clock isn't going to do its job. My interview suit, a smart black jacket and skirt, hung on a hook in front of my closet, and my sleep-deprived brain mistook them for a ghost at least twice. I ended up sleeping in a ball with the covers tucked up over my head, and when the alarm finally did wake me up, I was left in a hazy stupor for several minutes, staring at the clock and desperately trying to remember why I was getting up. I ended up setting it for another hour, giving me 2.5 to get ready, and slept just as fitfully and felt no better than the alarm's pained bleating dragged me into awareness once again. I hated waking up. That few seconds before I detangled myself from the bedclothes was always the hardest. Felt like something was missing, and I never liked that feeling. This time I managed to stumble into the shower, eat a dry bowl of cereal, and dress. My outfit was very conservative, the kind of thing you'd expect a teacher or the first female president or something to wear. I put on my most sensible shoes, black pumps of indeterminate brand. Getting into the car was weird. I felt like my aging hatchback, which did not smell like marijuana at all honest, would contaminate my clothes somehow. I put the address into my tablet and tossed it on the front seat, and gave it a few seconds to get its bearings and calculate the route. In case you're wondering, yes, I bought it used. Once it was ready to direct me to my destination in its nasally voice, I pulled out of my parents' driveway and started on my way. The tablet calculated the drive at about half an hour, which wasn't the best, but beggars can't be choosers. The drive itself was mostly highway, and I nervously kept the car 5 miles under the limit, feeling the dread laws of irony ready to pounce on me with a flat tire or an aggressive cop to delay my arrival at my appointment. No traffic snarls lay in my way, mostly because it was the middle of the day. I relaxed just a little when I pulled off the interstate and into the city. Miraculously, I avoided getting turned around, and the time I built into my trip came in handy, as I couldn't park at the building itself. I had to find a garage and walk. I paid my way inside and drove up to the 3rd floor. Rolled the windows down as I searched for a spot, and breathed in the damp, sepulchral air of the parking garage. All the sounds inside were amplified and echoed off the support beams and concrete retaining walls, including my car's engine. I found a spot in the corner near the elevator and pulled in. My dad always taught me to go up an extra floor or two. The distance to the elevator was the same no matter where you parked, but people are herd animals and want to park on the lower crowded floors rather than spend an extra 2 minutes driving up and taking the elevator back down. I rolled up my windows and made sure I had all my stuff, copies of my resume and my employment portfolio, and my purse. I looked around the mostly deserted garage and double-checked to make sure that my phone was on silent and that my pepper spray was on top in my purse and ready to be grabbed. My heels clicked loudly on the floor as I made my way to the elevator. It had that tinny smell that parking garage elevators have, a faint miasma of shoe, dirt, body odor and motor oil, even though it was spotlessly clean. Once I reached the ground floor, it was a short walk out in the open to the front of the building. I expected to be directed to a certain floor and suite. To my Surprise, as I walked into the lobby, it became clear that Luna Holdings owned the entire tower. I stumbled a little as I walked up to the security guards desk, a broad expanse of black marble as big as a car. The man behind it looked bored, though, and his uniform had that freshly pressed, sterile look that somehow makes a security guard look sloppy in spite of himself, like he's wearing a Halloween costume. I told him who I was and he issued me a badge and hooked a gnarled thumb towards the elevators. 27th floor. I felt my hands shaking as I waited for the elevator and balled one into a fist while I choked the strap of my purse with the other to keep them steady. The elevator doors were brightly polished steel that reflected the all-black of the lobby and made me look fuzzy and insubstantial in front of it. Stepped inside and gasped. The carpeting on the elevator floor was richer than the living room in my house, and the roof was gilded and the side panels were, well, they were actually wood, which was a decided step up from the sorts of elevators I was used to. I felt like I was riding an elevator above my station. After a while I decided the wood was mahogany, but I really have no idea. Either that or teak. They probably look completely different, but they both came to mind as expensive, and this place reeked of more money than God. It was a short ride up, and the speed of the elevator made my stomach feel like it had crashed into my knees. When it opened and I stepped off, I nearly walked into another woman. I skidded to a stop, my face inches from her chest. Not because I was looking at it, mind you, but because she was that tall, the tallest woman I'd ever met. As in basketball tall. She had on a dark jacket and skirt like mine, but it made my clothes look unbearably cheap. Everything she had on was silk, including the frilly white blouse under her jacket. I craned my neck up to mumble an apology, and she looked back at me through thick framed glasses. Some people's eyes smile, hers grinned, and they had a funny color. I'd call it green, but they were closer to gold. Her hair was loose and hung in a heavy, thick cascade well past her waist, just draped over her back. She put her hands on her hips and cocked to the side, turned her nose up a little, and sniffed. Karen, I presume? I was just on my way down to gather you up. I see you found your way in on your own. Yes, I said as brightly as I could. You must be Dash. She thrust out her hand. Lilith Chambers, Vice President of Human Resources. I took her hand. She was strong. It felt like shaking hands with a man. A strong man. She pumped my hand twice and let go. You've had déjà vu before, right? You know that feeling, how strange it is. The certainty that you've done this before or dreamed it and you're just now remembering. That feeling was like nothing compared to this. As her hand slid out of mine, I had an unerring certainty that I had met this woman before. Stood before her like this before. I was all nerves, but the touch of her hand was familiar, even comforting. Her whole posture changed when she looked at me, going from a rigid, almost manly pose to something softer, more open. Her hands fell to her sides. If she was startled the same way by me, she didn't show it. Right this way. I followed her through the office. No carpeting here, the floors were dark marble, figured with bright streaks that looked like lightning bolts. Her office was around a corner and through a set of double doors. She had her own receptionist, who looked bored when she glanced at me and immediately went back to work. Lilith's actual office was beyond that, in a magical world, where everything looked expensive. She had a lot of degrees, a lot of awards, and a lot of old books on gleaming shelves covered with glass doors. I looked at some of the spines and saw they were unmarked or in Latin, and they all looked old. She gestured to a guest chair in front of her huge battleship of a desk and dropped behind it into a reclining executive's chair, and leaned back at a jaunty angle. I looked around the room, trying not to get too goggly-eyed over her stuff. She had multiple master's degrees, 2 MBAs and a doctorate in economics. Half of the books on her bookcases were in other languages, mostly German and Latin, and some had a glass case to themselves which looked to be airtight. The spines were all elaborately decorated leather, some of it weirdly pale. So, she said, you're here about the executive assistant position? Yes, I said, hoping this wasn't a way to test if I actually remembered what I applied for, or worse, that I applied for one thing and was being interviewed for another. I couldn't count how many times I'd applied for a job as a manager and told I was interviewing for a sales position, a traveling sales position. She pulled out a folder and spread it on her desk. This all looks very impressive, Karen. I'm sure you're used to your skill set being undervalued. Out there, everything anyone cares about is all numbers, numbers, numbers. Here, we take a more personal approach. I see, I said, trying to make it sound like I had any idea where she was going with this. I apologize for the late hour. She yawned into the back of her hand. I'm not really a morning person. Are you? Not particularly, I said. She rocked in her chair for a moment and looked at me. I had the uncomfortable sensation that she was taking a very good look, an appraising look. I shifted a little in my seat. Her eyes were definitely golden in color, not green. After all, I'm not going to gild the lily, Karen. We're looking for a gopher. You'll be working up here running errands for myself and the other executives. The hours will be long, the work grueling, and while I'm sure the pay and benefits are more than adequate, we're not looking for someone with a sense of entitlement. Around here, a woman gets what she earns. No less, but no more. Okay, I said, not sure how to react. She sat up and leaned over the desk, resting on one arm with her hand splayed over my resume. I'm not looking for a brown noser either. There will be opportunities for advancement if you're offered this position, have no doubt. But to rise in the ranks here, you'll need a certain predatory spirit. I have to ask, I said, leaning back a little, what exactly do you do here? We like to say we're in the facilitation industry, she said, leaning back into her chair. We deal with very wealthy clients, both individuals and firms that have very specific and very expensive needs. You'll be signing a number of non-disclosure agreements should we offer you the position. I can't say much more, naturally, except that we deal in imports and exports, real estate, logistics. We find things that people are willing to pay a great deal to purchase and transport, and make sure they find their way to their new owners discreetly with a minimum of fuss. I swallowed. That sounded almost criminal. It certainly wasn't selling cheap knives door to door. She eyed me and started playing idly with her thick, dark hair in one hand. This sounds dumb, but I admit I was tempted to ask her what kind of conditioner she used. So, think you're interested? Yes, I said. She leaned forward again. So tell me, are you interested because you have bills to pay, or because you're hungry? I'm hungry, I said. I didn't sound very confident. And I have bills to pay. She's honest. That's adorable. I mostly hire humanities majors. Do you know why? I shook my head. Because they're hungry. They've been told for years they were making a huge mistake and they're tired of hearing it. Is that you? Yes, I said. I felt more confident now. I felt it. I knew people judged me for the major I picked. Even my parents. I wanted to be somebody. That's better, she said. Give me a few hours to think about you and I'll give you a call, all right? Don't you have any other questions? She gave me an intense, weighing look. No, I think I have what I need. Lucille will walk you to the elevator. I stood up and shook her hand again. Her grip made me wince. I tried not to be awkward as I walked out. The receptionist must have been Lucille. Walked silently at my side to the elevator. I rode it down alone, leaning on the brass railings that ran around the three walls, and hurried out to my car. The air outside was cool and crisp, and made everything feel real again. When I got behind the wheel, my hands were still shaking. I drove home in a daze, hugging the right lane and afraid someone would think I was drunk. My mom was at the table when I came through the back door. I must have looked like it went badly. She didn't ask. I went upstairs and sat down on my bed and sighed. I couldn't let myself get down over things like this. I stared at the printed stack of fast food applications on my end table, the pile of last resort, and sighed. I was about to fill them out, but decided to take a nap instead. Sometime around 8 o'clock it turned from a nap into a sleep, and it was around 9:30 when my ringing cell woke me up. Huh, I said, answering it without checking. Karen, hello. I've got good news. We're prepared to offer you the position. Can you start on, let's say, Monday? I blinked a few times, nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. Yeah, I said, trying not to slur my voice from sleepiness. Yeah, great. Come see me on Monday then, she said. Try to be in around 9. I blinked at that, and was about to offer a goodbye when she hung up. When I woke up the next morning, I half believed I'd dreamed it. Chapter 2. I was a little uneasy as I reported to work, dressed in my second best set of clothes. Until I had some money, I'd be alternating between best and second best. When I stepped off the elevator, no one was waiting for me. Figuring it Was some kind of test of my initiative. I headed for Lilith's office, desperately hoping I wasn't misremembering the path from the elevator to her door. When I found it, I pushed the door open a hair and peeked into the office. Her secretary gave me a bored look and I slipped inside quietly. Closing the door behind me, I looked at her, waiting for instructions. After an awkward half-minute, I was about to say something when Lilith came blasting out of her office, throwing open both doors and storming through with a weird mixture of fury and grace. Her charcoal gray suit clung to her every curve, immaculately tailored, and her spike heels made me feel a weird sympathetic pain in my ankle at the thought of trying them on. Overwhelmed, I sank back. There you are. I should have known you'd be early. I assume you have all the paperwork. I did copies of my IDs, all of that. Just hand those over to Lucille. You and I have work to do. I barely had time to drop the sheaf of paper on Lucille's desk before Lilith had an arm around my shoulder. Her presence was overwhelming and she smelled so intensely of lavender I almost sneezed, but under that scent was something else, earthy and metallic. You can't imagine how glad I am to make an addition to our little family, said Lilith, guiding me out into the hall. Is there, an orientation or something? She sighed. It was a deep, throaty one. Dear, don't be so meek. No, I'm from you, understand? I nodded and pushed my glasses up my nose. It's time for you to meet the team. Come with me. Her arm fell from my shoulders and I swear it came very close to my backside, so much so that I glanced back. She smirked a little and folded her arms behind her back, beneath that thick cascade of hair. It made her arch her back and thrust out her ample chest. I looked up to see her glancing at me from the corner of her eye, only to quickly look away. I edged away from her a little as we walked. The plush carpeting felt like it was tugging at my feet. It dawned on me as we passed a few people in the hall that most of the people here were wearing clothing ensembles that cost as much as a used car. To say I felt a little uncomfortable would be an understatement. Most of the men and a few of the women that we passed in the hallway gave me the same appraising look, like they were checking me out. Keep your eyes up, Lilith whispered. Don't look like a prey animal. Something about the way she said that made me shiver. She stopped at a door and grasped the brass knob in her hand and looked at me. You're swimming with sharks now. Eyes up. I nodded, swallowed, and followed her inside. As I walked into the office, I suppressed an inward grin. Whoever was sitting in the huge club-style chair behind the broad desk was facing away, rocking slightly, and if they had a fuzzy white cat on their lap, I was going to lose it. The inhabitant of the chair slowly turned around, and while there was a disappointing lack of cat, the effect was completed. The man sitting in the chair was either early 30s or late 50s, it was hard to tell. He had the unlined but hard face of a younger man, but his hair was streaked with pure white. He saw us and stood up and walked around the desk. I blinked. He was of a height with me and noticeably shorter than Lilith. She was unusually tall, but he was short for a man. He looked me up and down and said, "Ah, the new one." I blinked a few times and glanced at Lilith, unsure of what to do. His accent was odd, vaguely Italian but weird, like someone faking an Italian accent and getting it just a little wrong. Then he grabbed my hand and kissed it. He wasn't looking at me though. He looked at Lilith. She growled. I jumped, pulling my hand out of his, and took a step back. He pulled his own hand back and stuck it in his pocket and glared at me. "Oh, sorry." "You have nothing to be sorry about, Karen," said Lilith. "For Christ's sake, Jack." They gave each other hard looks for several seconds. I felt like I could slink away and neither would notice. "Anyway, this is Jack Gray, our Vice President of Acquisitions," said Lilith. "A pleasure," said Gray. "Forgive my impertinence. I forget myself from time to time." "Right," I said. "No harm done." Lilith took me by the arm and led me out of the room. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw him watching me. His lips were pressed tightly together, and he didn't move a muscle. He was as still as a statue. The only thing moving was his eyes. When we were out of eyesight, he closed the door. At least I think he did. Closed either way. It took me a dazed second to realize what was so off about his office. There weren't any windows. "Nice guy," I said. "Oh please," Lilith sighed. "Don't let him get to you. He does that with all the new hires. Let's meet the rest." The next few hours were a whirlwind. I met 20 people at least, all of them working under Lilith. They all had their little quirks, and sometimes I felt like I was a guppy swimming in a tank full of sharks, but I wrote that off as inexperience and nerves from my first day. After the introductions, Lilith led me back to her office where a contract was waiting on Lucille's desk. I took it, skimmed it, saw nothing about my immortal soul or anything of any particular interest, and signed it. Lilith was almost bouncy with excitement as I handed my signature over and took my documents back and stuffed them in my purse. "You can leave that in here," she said, gesturing to a chair in her office. Dropped my bag into it and waited. "I'll work on getting you your clothing allowance by the end of the day. For now, we need to get you familiar with the building and your duties." "As a gopher," I said. "You feel more like a rabbit to me. For now anyway. Go see Lucille, she'll have something for you." I nodded and stepped out into the little waiting room where Lucille waited. She handed me an internal transfer envelope, the kind that seals with some string around a pair of buttons and has boxes printed on both sides to be filled in with names and destinations so it can be used over and over again. This particular envelope had seen some work, judging by the tape sealing up the bottom edge. I took it and looked at the TO label. It was no one I recognized. "Here," said Lucille. She gave me a directory of the building. I ended up carrying it in one hand and the envelope in the other. It went to a very normal-looking bald man in rolled-up sleeves and a pinstripe tie on the 4th floor, who lived in a very ordinary-looking cubicle. If this was the first part of the building I'd seen, I'd hardly have thought there was anything out of the ordinary about any of it at all. He gave me another envelope and I carried it to another cubicle, and the process continued until I ended up carrying a very fat one upstairs. Rode the elevator up with it clutched to my chest, afraid if I dropped it the tape and staples holding it together would burst, and it would spill its contents everywhere. The string tie holding it closed was loose, and the flap was barely hanging on and needed new tape at the seam where it folded. I was tempted, very tempted. I looked around even though I was alone in the elevator and pushed the envelope open just to take a look. The paper inside was a shipping manifest. I knew that because it said shipping manifest right at the top. I pulled it out of the envelope just a little, making sure I could shove it back inside if someone was about to board the elevator with me. My throat went dry as I scanned the list. It was weird, and it got weirder as I slipped it a little further out of the envelope to read. Further down, 36 crates of soil weighing over 5 tons in total, a coffin and antique furniture, all shipped together. I was studying the list when the door to the elevator opened. I yelped and shoved the paper back inside, then hugged it to my chest and tried to look innocent. My thumb burned and winced. I'd given myself a paper cut as I rammed the manifest back into the envelope. Blood welled on the cut in a little uneven line of red beads. I tucked my thumb in my mouth and tasted iron. Jack Gray stepped into the elevator. "Ah, Karen, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," I said. Now, no need to be submissive. How do you like your job?" "Fine, I guess." He was staring at my thumb. 27, please." I hit the button. It was the same floor I was headed to, so it just made the doors close. As soon as they sealed shut, I felt an oppressive presence settle on my shoulders like phantom hands. Gray looked casual, but he was staring intently at my cut thumb. I could swear he was on the verge of licking his lips. I glanced down at the envelope. "Oh," I said. "This is for you." I handed it over and he took it. "You've cut yourself." "Yes," I said. "I'll get it bandaged up." He opened the envelope. "Oh my, look at this." The corner of the shipping manifest was tinted a rusty brown as the hint of blood from my paper cut dried. He smirked. His teeth were very small and very straight. His incisors looked sharp. "Were we peeking?" "I was just curious," I said. "I've been carrying stuff around all day. I didn't dash." "Don't worry. I won't tell on you. Just be careful now. You may learn something you don't want to know." "Okay," I said. "I have something I need you to run downstairs for me. Follow me to my office." I swallowed and stepped out after him. The hallways were weirdly deserted now, and he took a route that led towards the other side of the building, away from Lilith's office, but eventually looped back around to his. He unlocked it with a key and opened the door for me, gesturing for me to precede him. I glanced at him and stepped into the office, and he shut the door behind us and brushed past me. My heart clenched and jumped up into my throat as I felt him pass. He smelled like wet dirt and iron, and he moved in a weird, too quick way that set me on edge for some reason. He ducked behind his desk, reached into a drawer, and exchanged his envelope for another, equally battered one. His eyes tilted up before his head did, and he looked at me through his thick brows. His eyes were totally flat like a doll's eyes. He went still again, then stood up as normal. "You really should get a cart," he said. "Running one envelope at a time is terribly inefficient." "I'll look into it," I said. He walked towards me, holding the envelope out in front of him. I took it, but he didn't let go. I gave it a little tug, and still he held it. I looked up, and my eyes locked on his. I hadn't noticed them before, sort of mentally, filling them in with regular brown eyes, but they weren't. They were weird. There weren't any veins, the white so white they were like glass balls, and his irises were red, not brown, though very dark. They seemed to pulse as I stared into them, drawing me closer in jerky little movements. He let go of the envelope and I held onto it, but my arm fell limp to my side. He took a step forward and tilted my chin with his fingers, pointing my head up and back, and then a fist pounded on his door so hard it rattled in the frame. With a start, I jerked back and stared at him, then rushed to the door and pulled it open. Lilith was on the other side, fists on her hips and a wild look in her eyes. Her dense mop of hair and her stance made her look like some warrior queen, ready to swing a battle axe. I half expected her to be wearing war paint. "What are you doing?" I was dash. "Not you, him." "Me," said Gray. "I was just about to ask our latest recruit to join me for dinner. It's getting late." "She won't be joining you," Lilith said flatly, then to me, "Let's go." I headed out of the office, still clutching the envelope. I pressed it to my chest and hurried down the hall. Lilith stepped away and the door slammed, but she didn't even flinch. "Are you all right?" I shook my head. "Let me know if he bothers you again." "I won't permit it." "Thanks," I said weakly. "I have to." "That's for me," she said. I glanced at the envelope. She was right. I handed it over and she folded it under her arm. I looked at the floor and tried to change the subject. "Is it always this busy?" I said. "We're managing a very large account at the moment. This," she gestured with the package, "is no doubt a request for more staff for Jack's department. I'm not letting him poach you, trust me. Doesn't anybody around here have email?" She laughed. "Not everyone here is so progressive. You can only imagine how much trouble I had when I first took this position. Many of my colleagues had trouble accepting a woman. You'll notice there's no computer in Jack's office. Old-fashioned is the rule up here. Some of our employees actually use typewriters." "That can't be very efficient," I said. "No, but as you've probably gathered by now, our clients prefer the kind of security that only physical document storage can provide. Now what are you doing for dinner?" I stumbled a little. "What? Dinner? Food. You must be hungry, you've been on your feet since this morning. Did you even take a lunch break?" "No," I said, hunching my shoulders. "I actually forgot. I was hungry." "Good, you'll let me treat you then. Just us girls, right?" "Right," I said. "Good. Let's go lock these papers up and say goodbye to Lucy." Chapter 3. Somehow I ended up in her car. It was very expensive, had an Italian name, and was matte black. I was terrified as soon as she pushed the button on the dashboard. This car was so fancy it was too sexy for a key. The engine was loud and throaty, more of an overly loud hum than the kind of rumble you expect from a big engine. I could feel it vibrating through the seat right up my rump. Lilith read my mind and grasped the shifter in her hand, running her palm and fingers over the glossy carbon fiber knob in a way that made me feel a kind of hot queasiness in my stomach. She put the shifter in reverse and the car growled as she let out the clash and pushed in the gas and trundled out of the spot with a strange smoothness. Being so low to the ground was disorienting to say the least. The roof of the car barely came up to the trunks of the others parked in the garage. "It's better than a boyfriend," she purred, wriggling in the seat. "Trust me." I swallowed and let out a yelp as we rocked backwards out of the parking. But I clutched the seat belt in my hand as if it were a rope dangling from a ship and I was a castaway in the middle of the ocean. Lilith didn't bother with hers. She took the curves of the parking garage ramp at a perilous speed, sending my stomach into loops as it was shoved one way and then the other. Gee. only slow to flash her badge at the bored-looking security guard working the booth. As soon as the gate was up, she threw the car in gear and rocketed out onto the road, turning so hard it felt like the back end was moving on its own. The tires squealed, and I made a scared little noise through my lips that mimicked them. Lilith giggled, but giggle belies the sound she made. Throaty little laugh that was mostly amusement but had something else underneath. She had one eye on me as she downshifted and came to a stop at a red light. You've never ridden in one of these before, I take it? No, ma'am. Stuff the ma'am, she said. We're not at work. Besides, do I look like a man to you? Hey. I turned my head. Some guy had pulled up next to us in a bright red convertible. Nice car. Lilith flashed him a grin, and when the light turned, tromped on the gas. Screamed as I registered the sideways movement of the car as the back end wormed from side to side before we took off, and the acceleration shoved me back into the seat. I covered my mouth and watched in horror as the cityscape blurred and began to bend as Lilith worked the gears. A 90-degree turn was approaching, and I had a sudden shocking premonition of flying into the building ahead and smashing apart into a spray of expensive matte black body panels and a smear of executive assistant on the wall. Lilith laughed, did a funny little almost turn in the wrong direction, and whipped the car around. It went into the intersection sideways, leaving a smoking set of tire tracks on the road. It felt like my stomach hadn't caught up yet when the car tore forward, laughing and holding the wheel in one hand, her head propped on the other as she leaned on the door sill. She laughed at me and grinned. You are just the cutest thing, she mused. In spite of myself, I laughed and looked away from her. Her dark skirt had ridden up her leg, and I realized she wasn't wearing stockings under it. Was always there, but I'd never noticed before. The skin of her legs was smooth even though they were tightly muscled. She'd unbuttoned her jacket and the way she twisted in the seat pulled her silk blouse tight around her body. Words like bombshell and suck spring to mind. She could have been a model, and not one of those really skinny models that wears weird hats, the kind that models underwear because she makes a lacy bra look good, not the other way around. I looked out the window in time for her to pull up to the sidewalk in front of a velvet rope. A valet ran to the car and darted around to her side. She tossed him her key thing, which really wasn't a key. It seemed to make the car able to turn on just by virtue of being inside it, and walked past the car as if she were bored with it and it no longer interested her. I started to open my door, but she pulled it the rest of the way and gave me her hand. Her firm grip saved me the indignity of wriggling out of the car, about 6 inches above the ground in a skirt, a technique she had somehow mastered. She pulled me to my feet and put her hand on the small of my back. How are we going to get a table? I said. How are we? She laughed lightly. Pet, I own this restaurant. She took me past the line, tugging me along by the hand, and we went right inside the maitre d' and into the restaurant itself. I stumbled a little, shocked by how opulent and expensive everything was. The tablecloths were silk, and the waitstaff were all wearing evening wear. Lilith strutted through the place and flounced into a corner booth, crossing her long legs, and patted the rich leather seat with her hand, urging me to sit down. Dropped down beside her and she edged closer, until we were hip to hip. Glanced down and up at her, feeling heat on my cheeks, and in the interim a waiter had appeared and was presenting me with a menu. I took it and spread it open, and noticed that while there were some very expensive things on the menu, none of them had prices listed. It was hard to focus on reading. I could smell her. She was wearing a rich lavender perfume, but I could smell more than that, something that was uniquely her that made something in me stir. Shock. I nearly lost my grip on the glossy pages of the menu. Oh, I muttered. She leaned over to me. Her perfume and rich, dark scent were overwhelming. Don't worry. I'll pay for us both, pet. I glanced at her, wondering if I should say something about her calling me pet, but my mouth clicked shut and I said nothing. Thank you, Howard, she said to the waiter. We'll need a minute. She shifted a little closer to me and opened the menu. The way she sat, kind of leaning towards me with her legs crossed, made it so she was close to me, even though she was much taller than I was. I breathed in and smelled her peculiar musky scent and felt a little funny. She glanced at me with her big golden eyes and fluttered her long lashes, and reached over to tap her finger on suggested dishes on the menu. Half of them were in French and the rest were Asian-Italian fusion dishes with a lot of spices. After a brief deliberation, I decided on a vegetarian lasagna and set the menu aside. Didn't like eating meat. Lilith leaned over me and closed her menu and looked. As soon as the water made eye contact with her, he headed straight to the table and collected out menus. Lilith ordered for both of us, and the waiter returned in less than a minute with 2 tall flutes of champagne. I took mine, and Lilith took her, turning the delicate stem in her fingers. She smirked at me. Let it breathe. I waited, then took a sip and my eyes flew open. It exploded in my mouth. Riotous flowering of taste and gentle fizz that made me lick my lips and immediately take another drink. Lilith combed her fingers through her lustrous hair and sipped at her own champagne, watching my lips as I tasted it. Wow, I murmured, afraid to talk too loudly in a place like this. This is incredible. What is it? 400 a bottle, she murmured in my ear. She was sitting hip to hip with me now, turned to face me. In a curiously natural motion, she draped her arm on the top of the booth behind my shoulders. I sank into the soft leather with a little creak and down the rest of my champagne. Lilith motioned without even looking, and another waiter brought one of those ice buckets on a little stand, complete with an open bottle, and refilled both our glasses. Lilith downed hers all at once and watched me slowly sip mine. I stared back at her through the corner of my eyes, feeling odder and odder by the moment. I felt a shifty urge to slide away from her on the booth, but I kind of liked having her hip touch mine. Her skin was strangely warm, even feeling it through her skirt and my slacks, and the fizzy stuff made me feel a little heady by the time the food came out. Get giggly when I drink. Quite naturally, Lilith slid her arm down the booth and rested it on my shoulders. I moved to take my fork, but she picked it up before I could cut a little slice and smeared it in the sauce, and brought it up to my mouth. Pulled my head back a bit, stared at her, then leaned forward and took the little morsel. It was incredible, and I made a hungry little noise. She rested the fork on the plate and dug into her own dinner, a rare steak, taking turns cutting it and bringing the pieces to her lips with her fork, all without taking her arm off my shoulders. I drank a little more champagne and she poured more for me until I was starting to feel really fuzzy and goofy. Swallowed another bite of veal and spun up some spaghetti on my fork, and then Lilith leaned over and brought her mouth very close to my throat. She breathed in deeply, moving her lips over my skin without actually touching me, and her hair fell over my shoulder. It was so thick it was like a blanket. I said. You're adorable, she whispered. I glanced at her, then around at the restaurant. No one else was looking at us, but there were quite a few couples that were sitting close in their round booths like we were. Oh my God, I murmured. Lilith winced. I glanced at her, shook my head ever so slightly. Is this? I trailed off. Is this a date? She smiled. Her lips were a perfect red rosebud against her pale skin, and when they pulled tight, her smile was warm and predatory at the same time. Her lips peeled back just enough for me to see her canines, perfectly pearly white. Points that seemed just a little too long. Depends. Do you want it to be? My heart was thudding against my ribs, and I felt a warm itch between my thighs spreading up into my belly. Maybe, I said. Maybe, she repeated, her voice so soft it was like velvet. Maybe you want it to be a date. Why wouldn't you? Well, I said softly, I'm a girl and you're a girl, and her smile broadened. It's a bit more complicated than that, she said. I said, this is going to sound like a really stupid question. I think I'm a little drunk. Maybe, she said, leaning close into my ear. She tipped her head back and downed another flute of champagne and licked her lips. My eyes locked on her tongue, watching it dance in and out of her mouth. I said it before I even realized it. Are you a vampire? She laughed, a loud barking laugh, and this time she did get a few stares. She cared she didn't show it. No, pet, she said, slipping her arm down behind my back until it rested on my waist and her hand squeezed my hip. She leaned so close no one else could hear her, even if they were in the booth with us. I'm a werewolf. I sat straight up. Suddenly I felt a little more sober. She sat up with me and pressed closed, pulling me to her until I was almost on her lap. I'm a werewolf, sweet, she murmured in my ear. I want to eat you. All up. I swallowed. I hope you're speaking figuratively, I said. Mostly, she murmured. Karen, let's fuck. I blinked. Here. I wish we could, she said, caressing my side, her hand sliding from my hip to just under the curve of my breast and back again. I'd bend you right over the table and make you squeal in front of them all. I bet you'd like that. Wouldn't you? I looked around. I don't think so, I said. So shy, she whispered. No, let me take you home. Lay in my big bed with me. And we'll play. I looked at her and thought about it for a minute. I took another drink. My stomach felt like it was fluttering and I wasn't hungry anymore. Her hand went higher this time, and her fingers traced the curve of my breast through my blouse. I squeaked and bounced in the seat, and a jolt of need ran through my body. I licked my lips. Okay, I whispered. She nodded and grinned. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and held out a black credit card. Howard the waiter took it, blushing as he saw the way we're entwined. After it was gone, Lilith put both arms around me and kissed my throat, her lips fever hot and soft and wet against my tender skin. She kissed my neck. I felt her teeth hard and sharp. Then she pulled back. Karen, she said. There's something. She trailed off and looked away. I'm different. You just told me you're a werewolf, I said, blinking. The world was really warm and fuzzy now. Her credit card was back and Howard the waiter was edging away. She had to mean something else. It had to be joke. Maybe she liked to play dress up? She probably had a little pair of ears and a tail she liked to tuck into her panties. I'd heard of people doing that. You, Lilith snapped at the waiter. Go get me a car. He nodded and I stared at him for a second. What is it? I said. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, she said. You just told me you're a werewolf. She leaned closer to me. I'm an alpha, she whispered in my ear. That makes me a little different. I looked at her. How? I'll show you if you want. Wait until we get in the car. She took my hand and helped me out of the booth. The world tilted and I undid another button on my blouse. I felt hot, like I just eaten a big bowl of soup. My feet didn't seem to know where to go unless I concentrated on them. Lilith's strong arm around my waist helped. I think people were staring at us, but I didn't care. I was starting to feel very strange. A little noise escaped my throat and I stared at her. Her perfect creamy skin was taut over her throat and I moved my eyes along the curve of her jaw, then down to catch a glimpse of her heavy breast moving freely under her half-buttoned blouse. The urge to stick my hand in and cop a feel was overwhelming. I didn't understand it at all. I'd never looked at a woman that way before. Lilith took me outside, holding my hand tightly in hers. When she said to get a car, I thought she meant her car, but there was a black limo pulling up and she was guiding me inside. What about your car? I said lamely. Someone will fetch it for me later, she said. Besides, it's paid off. She leaned forward and snapped an address at the driver, and then closed the partition separating us. I got a glimpse of him before it closed, but I was distracted. I shifted on the seat until I was hip to hip with her, and before I knew what I was doing, my hand snaked into her blouse. My eyes shot open and she let out a little growl as I cupped her breast from underneath. Nothing I'd ever touched was so smooth, and she undulated on the seat, curling her arm around me and pulling me closer. My hand slid down her stomach and she arched, pressing against me. That's right, she said, her voice gurgling into a near growl. Rub my tummy. I burst out laughing. What did you just say? You heard me, she said, plunging her face into my neck, pushing me a little across the seat. Rub my tummy. Snickering, I started to stroke her belly, surprised by the ridged muscle I could feel under smooth skin. She let out a strange, hungry little noise and her hips pumped involuntarily. She was almost on top of me and I fell back onto the seat. My hand slipped lower, and my eyes widened as I quickly realized she'd been going commando under her skirt all night. I licked my lips and slid my hand lower, expecting to touch soft, moist lips. I sat up, my face a mask of utter shock. I sobered up an instant. Lilith saw the look on my face, and her features crumbled. Her lips trembled, and her eyes glittered. She abruptly pulled back across the seat and curled up at the door, closing her lights tightly and drawing their long, lithe length up against herself. I'm sorry, she muttered. I'll take you home. Wait, I said, moving closer. I didn't mean. I was just surprised, I dash. She looked at me and lowered her feet to the floor, and made a gesture of silence to her lips with her finger. Her voice was a low purr. I told you. I'm an alpha wolf, she whispered. You might say I'm the alpha wolf. I moved closer to her until we were hip to hip again. I don't know what to say, I said dumbly. That was true, this was one of those situations you never expect to run into. I never thought I'd by feeling up a woman anyway. And then, it's really big, I whispered. She snorted, and her lips cracked in a vulnerable little smile. Thanks, I guess. The car turned off the road. I hadn't even been paying attention to the world outside, so I didn't notice that we'd left the city and headed north towards Pennsylvania. Rich people lived up here, and I'd only ever been here one time. When my mother went to a doctor and another when my dad decided to splurge at a place that sells really expensive off-the-rack suits. I looked around as the car turned up a private road. Not a driveway, mind you, an actual road. The house looked old, and the car pulled in under a portico. Wow, this place is ancient, I said. For America, anyway. Lilith looked at me. How do you know? The doors and windows are all really oversized. That's how you tell if a house is really old, not just fake old. They used to open everything up to ventilate the place. I bet we're facing east. Very good, said Lilith, rubbing my back. She leaned over. I told you I love humanities majors. Now, I have a very important question for you. I looked up at her, into her smiling eyes. Still wanna fuck? She whispered. The door opened and she stepped out. She pulled a sheaf of $100 bills from her jacket pocket and shoved them all in the driver's hand, and he nearly dropped them staring at us. Both our clothes were askew, but Lilith looked amazing, like she'd done it on purpose. She dragged me by the hand towards the front door as the bewildered driver stared at us and pushed inside. The butler opened the door for her. I nearly fell over. She had a butler. Perkins, she said in a strangely enthusiastic voice. The stooped old man looked at me and grunted, then turned to head off into the house. I didn't say anything to him. I was too busy staring. Marble, gold leaf, teak. The place screamed expensive in every language at the top of its lungs. My family would never make enough money together to afford all this in our entire lifetimes or multiple lifetimes. I was a little overawed, but only for a second. Lilith took 3 steps into the room, let her coat pool on the floor, and began stripping off her blouse. She had it off in half a second and on the floor, and flexed her lithe, gracefully muscled back. I stared openly as I saw the outer curves of her head, breasts from behind as she pushed out of her skirt and stepped out of her heels. You're naked, I said stupidly. Nothing Perkins hasn't seen before, she said, turning around. Well, what do you think? I looked her up and down. Like I said, I never really looked at a woman sexually before. I did now.